Today we're diving into this book, The Road to Empire by Satnam Singh. It's a book that helps trace Sikh political identity and how that will lay the foundation for various forms of Sikh rule to come. Amongst the 7 or so questions that we'll go through today, we'll ask, how did Guru Gobind Singh Ji use literature in forming the Khalsa? In what ways did ideas like kingship and sovereignty get molded by Indo-Islamic traditions? And when did these political and philosophical ideas turn into real territorial claims? This is just a teaser for our live event on the 3rd of November in Birmingham. If you haven't already got your tickets, please do so via the link in the description below. We have already sold 60% of all of our early bird tickets, so make sure you secure your seat today. Otherwise than that, let's dive straight into this. Alright, so I guess to start with, I want to ask then, how does Guru Gobind Singh Ji use literature, like the works in the Anandpur library and the Dasam Granth for argument's sake, to help shape an early political identity for the Khalsa?
Very good question. It was one of the questions I was wondering myself when I embarked on this kind of research. So one thing we often don't really appreciate in Sikh history is that there's a lot of ideas underpinning the developments. Now, what does that actually mean? We often think of the Sikhs' road to empire as being one of martial training. The Sikhs, they get a sword in their hands and learn how to wield the swords and the muskets and the guns. And then, lo and behold, within a few decades, they suddenly have a kingdom of their own. And a lot of the books that's been written so far by other authors, they have obviously gone into all the military strategies, all the battles that the Sikhs were fighting. What I wanted to know is not how the Sikhs were fighting, but what were they fighting for? What were the ideas? Why were they willing to kill themselves? Not even like kill themselves, but why were they willing to fight in all these battles against some of the biggest empires the world had ever seen at that time? The Mughal Empire, the Afghan Empire, the Marathas, the British Empire, British soldiers and so forth. What was it that they were willing to fight for? What were the ideas they were willing to die for, right? And one thing I realized is that Guru Gobind Singh Ji, very early on in his career as a guru, he begins to gradually change their Sikhs' way of thinking. The stories that they're telling each other, the kind of literature and the books that they're reading and talking about within their own circles. And that's the intriguing part. This is what my book looks into. Like, what were these stories? Why these stories? How were they being reworked, retold, and so forth? Now, sometimes people ask, like, what's the point with these stories? Why all this storytelling? Like, if you and I were to study a political theory, we would start to read treatises, right? Like political stuff that says this is how you do so. But what we see in the Anandpur Darbar is stories primarily. So a lot of the philosophical teachings are packaged and packed within a story. So you have to actually read the story, discuss it, and then kind of get the gist and the juice out of it. It's not like it's a treatise where it's just given right there and then. So like when you and I went to university, you're provided the idea right there and then. Here it's within a story, and sometimes it's an animal story, sometimes it's within an erotic story. So that's kind of like what I was starting to look into.
So would it be fair to say then that this is very much similar to the way the Janam Sakis would have been written, which is like they are not really history, they're more kind of hagiography, and they're more kind of Aesop's fables in that they're telling a story that contains Guru Nanak Dev Ji, but actually it's the meaning of the story that's more significant?
To some extent, you could make that comparison. Each story has some kind of message it wants to impart, and it wants the reader to sit with like-minded people and talk about them and kind of get the gist out of it. But I think Guru Gobind Singh is also trying to break the shackles of the minds of the Sikhs at the time. So what do I mean by that? What we see is that the stories that Guru Gobind Singh introduces, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the event in November. But what we see is that a lot of the stories that Guru Gobind Singh is feeding and serving to his followers, to his Sikhs, is stories about kingship. It's stories about what we call rajniti, how to govern societies, and so forth. And it's very prominent since the early days of Guru Gobind Singh's Raj. So Guru Gobind Singh himself is very young at this time. So Guru Gobind Singh is basically trying to say there's a whole literature out there on kingship, how to govern territory, how to be rulers of societies. What you see around you in the Mughal Empire, the Afghan Empire, the Hindu Rajput Hill Kings, whatever they're doing, we can do that better. But first, let's start by reading their stories, their literature, and to get a understanding of their political science. Then eventually we can rework it and kind of do it better, if that makes sense. So I know this is a bit of a weird comparison, but I think what Guru Gobind Singh is trying to also do is he's trying to change the role models of his followers. Now, why is that important? Well, when you have a role model in front of you, what you're trying to do is that you want to be like that person, right?
Yeah.
So if you have a football player you look up to, you want to be as good as him.
Mm-hmm.
If you have some influencer you're looking up to online, you want to have as many followers as him or her, right? So that becomes your standard, your point of departure, what do you want to call it? That's like your benchmark, right? What Guru Gobind Singh Ji does is that he changes the standards of who the Sikhs can become. He changes the standards of who the Sikhs can be, right? And in this regard, a lot of the people that Guru Gobind Singh is introducing to his followers are kings of the past. They were emperors, both from the Islamic world, but also obviously from the South Asian, Indic, Sanskrit civilization. But not only that, he's not just saying, because the thing with people is that their mind is often quite limited. They can't really think outside of what they hear and learn. So, like let's use a modern example. If you have an influencer that you look up to and this person has 1 million followers, then that's your aim. You want to have 1 million followers yourself. That's like how the brain works. You kind of see, same with football and so forth. But what Guru Gobind Singh does is they say, well, these were kings, and these were great kings of the past, but you can become emperors. So you can outcompete them. You can outdo these heroes that you have. You can be even better warriors. You can be even better kings, even better emperors. So it's that constant, I think in modern terms, psychology, you call like growth mindset. It's that constant striving for perfection, striving for something bigger, striving for something better. And I think for the Sikhs at that time, I think that was quite a radical transformation of their mind and their thinking.
In your view, then, what role did translations, often from Sanskrit or Persian into Punjabi, play in creating that political thought amongst the Sikhs? So, as you're saying, that these stories, these ideas, these concepts are being all kind of brought together to the Anandpur Darbar and are kind of being mixed, and it's like a university essentially. And were there also important original work?
So I think what Guru Gobind Singh does is that, let me take a step back. I think, and I'll be happy to prove him wrong here, but I think the way we understand Sikh history so far is that up until the time of Guru Gobind Singh's reign or Raj, the Sikhs were primarily circulating stories about the previous gurus. Yeah, what they were reading was the Janam Sakhis, they were reading the Varas of Bhai Gurdas, they were reading obviously Gurbani, right? So a lot of it was kind of Sikhi centered. What we would understand as Sikhi today, that's kind of what they were doing. What Guru Gobind Singh Ji does is that he wants the Sikhs to engage more with the world around them that they see. And that's why he brings in this whole new literature from the Mughal, from the Sanskrit civilization, the Persianite world, and so forth, so that they can better get a grasp of the world around them. So for about 20 years or so, this is a very long project, by the way. Imagine, trying to think back, what were you doing 20 years ago, right? I think if you started back then all the way till now, that's how long they were just engaged in a comprehensive study of history, of political science, of mythology, astrology, astronomy, botany, all these like natural social sciences that we know of today. The Sikhs were engaged in a very comprehensive study of those things, basically saying, what has humanity come up with so far? What the accumulated knowledge of the world, whatever the people around us have come up with, we will study it, we will master it, and eventually we will challenge it. So that's why in my book, I go into, in the second chapter, I go into a lot of detail about, a comprehensive curriculum, you can almost say, about what the Sikhs were studying. Now, the idea of why they're even going into the Sanskrit world and the Persian world and even like maybe the Arabic literature as well is because the Sikhs at this time didn't have any of this of their own. Maybe there was a sporadic medicine Granth here and there, but there wasn't a sophisticated study and a library of the Sikhs at this time. So the Sikhs basically had to look up, what had the Muslims, the Hindus, and all these other groups in India at the time, what had they accumulated? Then again, like I said, first read it, then understand it, debate it, then master it, then challenge it. And to answer your question then is that there was, the most famous one is the Prem Sumarak, which is technically a Ratnama, which talks and outlines a lot of rules for the Sikhs in terms of marriage, in terms of food, in terms of how to conduct yourself on a day-to-day basis, and so forth. But the important chapter, with the ones that I look into, is how to set up your own empire, how to set up your own multicultural kingdom or empire, right? Now, the interesting thing here is that this is an original, that's what you're asking about. This is an original Granth. It's not pure translation. There are elements where you can see that whoever wrote this Granth has already studied previous political science books from particularly the Mughal world and also perhaps like Chanakya's Arthashastra and so forth. So you can see it's kind of built on all earlier works. But the interesting thing is that there's a Sikh ethos that's kind of grained into it. So they say this is how the greatest empire at the time looks like, the Mughal Empire. This is how we can adjust it, rework it, and make it more Sikh-like, if you want to put it like that. Now, if you were to do a modern comparison with that, is that you'd have a lot of Sikhs sitting, let's say, in Birmingham, in London, in Washington, whatever. They're bringing in all the classical and the modern knowledge on political science. Habermas, Adam Smith, whatever all of their names are, Karl Marx, everything that's been accumulated. Say, all right, we'll master it. Then we'll start to pick and choose what serves our purpose. Then they'll combine it into a coherent work. Now, a Gora who would read this book then would probably say this looks a lot like modern democracy, but he would also be stumbled by a lot of the foreign Sikh teachings that are embedded within this democratic rule or whatever you want to call it. So to answer your question, there's a lot of new things, there's a lot of old things. And this is what you would call a form of innovation, basically. In the aspect of political science in Sanskrit civilization, Indian civilization, the Sikhs are actually doing an innovation here, an innovative contribution to how rajniti has been developed and understood in India.
Which perfectly leads me on to the next question, which is in what ways then did the Indo-Islamic political traditions influence how the Khalsa started to think about kingship and sovereignty? And I guess you've kind of already alluded to it already, but does it go just beyond kingship, or is just kingship and the idea of kind of a divine ruler the only kind of political theory that they can think of at this point?
Now, this is interesting because from the Granths that the Sikhs were studying from the Indic civilization, so that would be the Puranas, the Mahabharata, and so forth, what you say here is applicable, that a lot of these Granths will talk about the ruler of the country, the king, being divine. He's a divine figure, so to speak. And therefore he has to be obeyed, and he's like a incarnation or manifestation of God on earth, right? When the Sikhs back then were studying the writings on political science from the Islamic world, then they would encounter a caliph, most likely, or a sultan, who is not a divine figure. A caliph, he would be the shadow of God, perhaps. That's like the closest you would get, or a successor to the Prophet Muhammad. But never God himself, or an image of God, or like divine in any way. And what you see in the Prem Sumarg then is like the mingling of these two traditions into the Maharaja of the Sikhs, of the Raj of the Sikhs that's in behind there. So what you see is that it's a dharmic Maharaja, kind of known from the Sanskrit civilization. He kind of has some of the same job functions and duties, but he's not divine in any way. He's not someone who needs to be worshipped or stuff like that. So that's, you could say, I don't know, like in a simple way, that's kind of the Islamic influence on it, perhaps. If you were to look at like from pure secular, this is like the secular reading of it. This is maybe the Islamic influence from the Persianite world, how they were viewing the Sultan, the Caliph, and so forth. But then again, it's not just a copy-paste of previous, because as I also talk about in my book, even though in many ways the Maharaja looks like a proper Dharmic Indian king of the last 2,000 years, he doesn't have any of the classical duties associated with kingship. So in these Shastras and so forth, that would be that it's the job of the Maharaja to promote the caste system, to protect the Brahmins, to honor the Brahmins, to basically serve the Brahmins. None of that is actually mentioned in the Prem Sumara, even though it's been influenced by Indic writings. So the authors of the Prem Sumara, they were most likely aware, so the Khalsa Sikh authors, they were most likely aware that these verses were to be found in the original Shastras, but they chose not to bring it in to a Sikh ruling system, if that makes sense. Now, the thing is that if we go into the Prem Sumara, it talks a lot about kingship. Basically, a lot of the books of Sikh political science until very recently was about kingship. That's the only form of governance that was known in the world at the time. So that's what they studied, they mastered, they challenged, but they also preserved it. But they just enhanced it and made it better. So what they did, for instance, I talk about in my book as well, is that the Maharaja is someone who's punishable by the law. So the Maharaja is not, he's under the law, he's not above the law, which he is in the Mahabharata and in a lot of Indic scriptures, even under Islamic law. I think the Caliph is above the law. Here you actually see the Sikh author saying, the Maharaja has to follow the same rules as everyone else. It's not just in theory, this also put into practicality that there's a person, I can't remember his job title, he's like a judge within the kingdom. And he has the powers, he's been delegated the powers to punish the Maharaja and his family and his ministers if they break the law.
Oh, wow.
Again, but one thing I want to emphasize is that in this book, it goes... and a lot of stuff I talk about is kingship.
Yeah.
But there's nothing in Sikhi that, I mean, it's a no-brainer, but there's nothing in these Anandpuri writings that says kingship is a sacred form of governance.
Yeah.
So like in the Islamic tradition, they would say that the caliphate is a sacred form of governance. We don't have any of that.
So it's not like, for argument's sake, how the divine right of kings in Europe existed, where the king was essentially the representative of God on earth. It's very much more so like the king is a way of governance and he has a role to play, and that's it. There is no divinity by default of his standing.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it.
Yeah.
It's like that's like his mission in life. It's his seva. He's following the same rules and the same philosophies and the duties of life as everyone else. Karma, all these things. He's answerable to karma as well. Yeah.
Okay. Obviously, we've been talking about how these stories and these histories and these moral teachings and fables have been adopted by the Anandpur Darbar, mastered, critiqued, kind of reformulated, original works are produced. How do they manage to balance high ideals, so kind of big philosophical questions like, for argument's sake, what is the best form of governance, with the practical needs of statecraft, like, for argument's sake, I don't know, being able to tax everyone being a really obvious example? And why were those kind of intricacies and really finer details so important in ensuring that Sikh power did arise so quickly and for so long post Guru Gobind Singh Ji?
That's a very deep question, actually. I think we'll probably go more into that during the live talk when we meet in November. I think the way I would answer it shortly, or like to put a different spin to it, is that Guru Gobind Singh Ji wants the Sikhs to, again, because Guru Gobind Singh is trying to reprogram the minds of his followers to go out of that black and white, right and wrong kind of thinking, sinners and saints, all this stuff. Like, the world is more nuanced than that. There's a gray zone, and we need to go into that gray zone and kind of highlight it, right? So a lot of the granths that are in the Anandpur court are actually what they would call the Niti Granths in the Sanskrit Indian civilization. It's basically illuminates the moral gray zones of life. So let me just give you a quick example, like, because this is an example that most of the listeners will be able to recognize. after the Shahidi of Guru Tegh Bahadur in 1675, Guru Gobind Singh Ji asked the question, were there no Sikhs in Delhi at the time? Someone who could stand up and protect my father, right? So at this point of time in history, the Sikhs and the Gurus had been there for about 150, 60 odd years. So there were a lot of Gurmukhs out there. There were a lot of people who had mastered meditation, mastered spiritual stages, and so forth. So Guru Gobind Singh is asking, were there no Sikhs there who could either be recognized or even better stand up in defense of the Gurus and the other Sikhs' lives? And then, as the story goes, Guru Gobind Singh Ji becomes very disgusted by the fact that there were many Sikhs in Delhi. There was a big Sikh community, wealthy traders, wealthy businessmen, the Khatris, None of them stood up. So Guru Gobind Singh Ji goes into this, again, process of reprogramming his mind. He says they had become too gullible. They had become too meek. The Sikhs at the time had become too merciful, too compassionate for their own good, because they could easily be slapped around, basically.
Yeah.
So, and we know all these stories, even like people in our own lives, very humble people who never get the promotion at job. They never get the promotion at work because everyone's just running all over them, right? They're too humble for their own good. They're being walked all over by people, their enemies and their friends, and so forth. So what Guru Gobind Singh Ji says is that, what was the purpose of having attained so high spiritual stages when you can't even defend yourself? Like, have a little bit of, I think English call like, have a little bit of backbone, right? Stand up, be proud of yourself.
A pair of balls, as the English would say.
As the Englishman would say. So what the Niti Granth does is that it actually teaches you how to live in this gray zone.
Yeah.
Basically. How to basically not just be slapped around by anyone, friends, family, authorities, and so forth. And I go into a lot of that in the early book to say how does that look like in these stories and in these granths. But that's also why most people today misunderstand what all these Charitrapakyan and all these Hitopadesha and all these books are about, because it's kind of a no BS kind of philosophy it espouses. There's a lot of stories where the people are not listening to the spiritual authorities, they're not listening to the Gyanis or the Granthis, whatever they were called back then. They're just following their own whims, they're following their own common sense instead of obeying religious authority and so forth. A lot of people say this is not religious stuff, but it is. But it's in a different kind of religion, because it's telling you to basically use your brain a little bit. Have a little bit of brain and use it. Don't just follow other people blindly. In the sense of Guru Tegh Bahadur Shidi, like, the rulers were slapping you about, you're just sitting there like humbly kissing the same hand that's beating you up, right? So I think it didn't quite answer your question, but I think I want to leave it at that, in the sense that a lot of these stories in the Charitrapakyan, in the Dasam Granth, and the Hitopadesha and the Panchatantra, now I'm just name dropping a lot, is actually stories that has a point of departure from the angle of the gray zone, the niti, the critical thinking, where right and wrong, it ceases to exist. There's no right and wrong. There's no black and white. There's no hot and cold. It's just use your brain, use some common sense in this situation. So let me just give you an example I always use. I think it's from the Upanishads. There's a story that there's a sadhu sitting. And the basic idea is basically that even like telling the truth is not always the best thing to do. And people are like, what? Like, what do you mean? Of course you should tell the truth. The Prem Samadhi also says that always tell the truth unless it might hurt someone. Then don't be an idiot. Don't hurt their feelings just by telling them the truth. So someone asks you, do I look fat in this? Just say, no, you don't.
Yes, you do. You're massive.
No. You must speak the truth. You look massive. Just, so there's a sadhu. He's sitting there meditating, probably reached such kind by now. And then he opens his eyes and he sees a chicken coming running.
Yeah.
And he sees it like run around the corner. He goes back to his meditation. 2 seconds later, he sees a butcher, a man with an axe in his hand, coming running with his axe. And he's asking the sadhu, like, where did the chicken go? Now, here's this plot, or what do you want to call it? What does the sadhu do in this situation? Does he speak the truth and preserve his dharam, fully knowing that if he speaks the truth and tells him where the chicken ran off to, the chicken will die?
Yeah.
Or does he tell a lie and say that it ran the other direction, thereby saving the chicken but breaking his dharam because he's telling a lie?
I would say he picks the third option and he keeps the chicken for himself.
Kala. So obviously this is a very simplified way of basically saying like what is truth, what is falsehood, what is error, what is black, what is white. A lot of this does not make sense in the real world. And to answer your question shortly, when you are in the realm of governance, when you're in the realm of ruling over people, not just 10 people, but millions of people, you can't just live in a black and white OCD kind of world. You need to constantly be critical, constantly make exceptions to the rules and so forth. In the Prem Samara, just a quick example, it says this is the tax rate, this is how much you take from the produce from the farmers.
Yeah.
But then it says, but if it hasn't been raining for so and so many months, then don't tax them, because then they need this food for themselves.
Yeah. So it's actually taking those grand kind of philosophical ideas and turning them into apply them practically in each given moment rather than applying kind of a rule of universality or whatever. I guess one question that this is more so because I'm a nerd when it comes to this type of stuff, but you've obviously been talking a hell of a lot about the Anandpur Darbar and with obviously great clarity, considering that you've written this book, which I've obviously enjoyed reading.
Thank you.
I just want to know then, what was the research process like? What was your source material? How did you find it? Like, what did you read? What are perhaps some of the most interesting tidbits that you came across? And was there anything where you went, okay, I wasn't expecting to find that?
A very good question. Like I said, a lot of the issue is that, well, that's my take on it. A lot of this stuff has not really been covered so far. So a lot of it was basically constructing a new history. I had to find the sources, had to find the manuscripts. Luckily, some of them are in London or other places around Europe. In the UK and other places around Europe. But I had to read from scratch. Then, as soon as I had noticed some patterns that a lot of the stuff Guru Gobind Singh is translating is rajniti granths. Then that became the lens through which I started reading the Dasam Granth. Or maybe that's how we should read it, not as a story about sexual morals or Vishnu and Hinduism and all that, but actually here's a new lens to look through it. Then I started to read Guru Gobind Singh's life in that light. Then I can see that a lot of this Rajniti stuff, the political science, is actually there throughout his whole life. So the Rahat, for instance, we look at the Rahat today as a form of rules to obey, like the Sharia for the Muslims or the Jewish laws for the Jews, right? But what you can see with this lens is that a lot of the Rahat is actually about making the people sovereign. The rules are there to make you act like a king, to think like a king. Yeah. So a lot of this stuff would be considered like the way that Sikhs back then were told to dress, to wear turbans, to be shastratari, wear swords, to carry jewelry even. That's basically telling the Sikhs to start dressing like kings of the time. And of the ancient kings as well, even though they haven't become kings yet. Yeah, but start to live the dream today, and it'll eventually
manifest tomorrow. Yeah.
I think it's like in English you call it manifesting things, or like speaking things into existence.
Yes, into existence. Yeah.
So when I was reading the same Granths, the Bursuba and so forth, I noticed that this is actually a part of the reprogramming of the Sikhs, not just through literature, but through their daily practice and their daily life. So speaking it into existence. And then again, I could just see that Guru Gobind Singh is doing this very consistently. He's looking at this, he's reprogramming the whole community to start thinking like kings, but also to act like kings. And eventually, with Bandha Singh Bahadur and so forth, they actually implemented something in the real world that had obviously imperial dimensions. So that was one thing, like coming up with this, to observe the patterns. Then to start rereading the same sources, the same history books I've already read, start to go through a lot of them with this new awareness. Then I started to obviously notice new things I hadn't seen before. Then put that into note form, reach out to other people, speak to, read about obviously, like what happens is that when you're reading one book, you'll start to notice that there are little references to other books, then you have to get them, obviously buy them, and all of a sudden you have a massive library yourself.
Yep.
And then after that is just writing the stuff down and sending it out to people, getting challenged with my ideas. I have to rewrite, revise, and so forth. It's you have a history background as well. This is like proper like Disneyland. This is nothing gets better than that.
Yeah.
But one thing is also, I think, one thing I've enjoyed is also like one thing is reading and writing, but the other one is setting up a lifestyle that is akin to or conducive, whatever the English word is, to actually writing a book. Because I kind of realized that I have to put in it's like going to the gym, right? You don't just go to the gym and lift weight and that's it. You need to be mindful of your sleep, what you eat, how much you like intake of water, all these things. It becomes a lifestyle. And I realized that very late in the process. So at one point when I was the most productive for a period of about 2-3 months, whatever it was, I had a very good discipline where I would get up very early in the morning, then sit and read or write for 2-3 hours, then go to work, eat healthy, obviously at work, then come home and maybe read a little bit, and then go for long walks or go for a run. And I had actually told myself, and I did that for a very long time, and I told myself I was too lazy, because I'm very lazy by nature, that one day I didn't want to read in the afternoon after work, because I was tired, then at least go out for a run. So at least I had done something that would be useful the next day, because my brain would be more like clarity and so forth. So it was actually quite interesting. Like that, for 2-3 months, I kept this up very consistently. Food, what I was drinking, what I was sleep-wise, how much I was reading, how much I was writing, exercising at the gym sometimes as well. So yeah.
Nice. Well, penultimate question then. In the book, you argue that Khalsa communities begin asserting real territorial control around 1710, the earliest, to 1716, and then you have the Lahore Rajas coming in at 1760-ish, and then obviously Maharaja Ranjit Singh's period begins in 1799. What does this, and I know we can't go into too much depth, and I guess we're teasing for the live event, but what does this timeline reveal about the early stages of Sikh state building? Because Guru Gobind Singh Ji, depending on which sources you read, passes away around 1707, 1708, and it's only a couple of years after that real territorial control is being asserted by Sikhs. And then less than 100 years later, you have essentially what is the beginning of the Sikh Empire that everyone is probably more familiar with. So, obviously, from your study, from the work that's gone into this book, how do you summarize that period of less than 100 years?
I would say so what I try to do is that I actually try to show 3 different expressions of Sikh Raj. So one is the Raj of the Guru. So I'm actually trying to take the timeline back a bit and say, well, there was actually a Raj in the time of Guru Gobind Singh, the Anandpur Raj. And I use my evidence for that is that the court poets in Anandpur, they actually described that they had written so-and-so book in the Anandpur Raj, or in the Raj of Guru Gobind Singh, or in
just
Sikh
on that,
Raj.
Just on that though, what makes that reference a political reality rather than just kind of being some type of spiritual title? Because obviously the gurus from very early on are calling themselves the true kings, and those kind of comparisons are made. But then at the same time, in a lot of pre-colonial Sikh literature, you actually have the assertion, which when I first read it, I found quite surprising, that the only reason the house of Babur exists is because of Guru Nanak Dev Ji, and it only dismantles again because of the house of Guru Nanak Dev Ji.
It's a very good question, and I addressed that in the book as well. So a lot of the Sufi saints and the Bhagats of the Indian subcontinent, they have used this royal vocabulary in their writings to talk about God as the true king, the Sacha Pacha, the Gurus as Sacha Pacha, talk about the Raj, when talking about the reign of a particular Sheikh or Guru or whatever it might be. Now, what I say with Guru Gobind Singh, why we should take these claims more literally or materially when it says this Granth was written in the Raj of Anandpur or the Raj of Guru Gobind Singh, is basically because we have to add it up. This is like how you do the historical construction of history. You have to add it up with who or what else Guru Gobind Singh Ji was doing at this time. So we know that the Guru Gobind Singh Ji built forts around, not like spiritual, metaphorical forts, but like literal forts.
Literal physical
around,
forts,
physical forts around Anandpur. We know that there was an army, that we know that a lot of royal symbology of sovereignty was being exercised by the Guru. We know that because the Mughal sources are talking about this as well. There are even like hukamnamas from the Mughal court as early as 1690, I think, where it says, it's a hukam from Delhi to the governor of Punjab saying you need to stop Guru Gobind Singh Ji from acting like a king. Otherwise, we will come after him, basically. So there's even these attempts very early, this is like 10 years before the Khalsa is even created, these early attempts where the Mughals are noticing Guru Gobind Singh and the Sikhs are starting to do state activities. So all of these things combined, there's an army, there's elephants, there's a court, like there's all this literature being produced and patroned. There's wars obviously taking place against kings, not against tribal leaders, but it's against other kings in the region. All of this combined makes it very sensible to argue that the claims that we see in the Anandpur court by the poets should be taken literally. Another thing I also mentioned is that a lot of the court poets who talk about the Raj of Anandpur, the Raj of Guru Gobind Singh, the Sikh Raj being expansive, is actually we can see that in the names, it's the court poets who came from Delhi. It's the former Mughal poets. They're the ones making these claims, which is very interesting, obviously, for many good reasons. It's not just like a nerdy sadhu kind of poet, right? These are like proper people who came with a tradition in the Mughal Darbar or in the Rajasthani courts. They are saying this is the Raj of Guru Gobind Singh we're now serving. So basically I take the timeline back and I say the first Raj, the physical Raj that we have in Sikhism, not with Banda Singh Bahadur, is actually with Guru Gobind Singh Ji. What Banda Singh Bahadur creates is probably a re-establishment of that Raj that had been destroyed by the Mughals under the siege of Anandpur. So it's re-establishing something that had already been there, but this time around, it's actually over a much larger territory. A much larger territory where the Sikhs are now a minority population, whereas in Anandpur they were the majority. So now they're minority rulers. The coins that we see in the Anandpur collection and so forth, these, some historians have argued, were actually struck in the Anandpur court and then later resurfaced with Banda Singh Bahadur, but they weren't struck by him. That's like an interesting take on it. And this is why the later Missals and Maharaja Ranjit Singh, they continue that same couplet, the Persian text, on their coins, not because they were copying it from Banda Singh Bahadur, but they were copying it from Guru Gobind Singh Ji, which obviously makes sense, right? Because they're Sikh rulers, they're not Bandai Khalsa, right?
Yeah, no, it does make sense, but then it makes me question why. I don't know. I guess it's also, I already kind of have an answer, but then I'm also kind of like, why would Guru Gobind Singh Ji refer to himself on the coin?
We can talk about that at the event.
I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that, and I think that there's loads of reasons I can think of as well that would explain why. But I think it's interesting to go into that, and obviously we'll save that one. But yeah, sorry, carry on. So there's a theory that these coins were actually struck in the Anandpur Darbar and then resurfaced with Banda Singh Bahadur's reign. And
then again, the Banda Singh Bahadur's rule is toppled, and then roughly 30, 40, 50 years later, depending on the timeline, or what you consider a Raj, then they resurface once more. So what we see is that every time the Raj is destroyed by the Mughals, the Anandpur Raj is destroyed in 1704, Banda Singh Bahadur is in 1715, I think.
Yep.
The Sikhs, even though they've been militarily beaten, their spirit is still thriving to re-establish that Raj. This is why I say the political reprogram Guru Gobind Singh was so successful, that even though the Mughals managed to kill a lot of Sikhs, they couldn't kill the idea of Raj amongst the Sikhs. No. And once you've implanted an idea in the minds of the people, you can't really do anything about it. Now they're going to go for it regardless, even till the last man standing, basically. And that's what's interesting about the Sikh community as a case example is that even though they keep getting beaten up, massacre after massacre, they could make it so easy for themselves by saying, all right, we'll stop thriving for Raj. We'll just be citizens, pay our taxes, bend our heads. But they didn't do that. As soon as a new conqueror came into India, like Nadir Shah from Persia, he's a new guy on the scene. Even him, the Sikhs started attacking him.
Yeah.
So they're not even making their own lives easy here. Why? Because they've been reprogrammed by the Guru 50, 70 years earlier. And they've been reprogrammed by their dads and their granddads who had spent time with Guru Gobind Singh. So it's this idea is so firmly embedded within the community at this time that you can't really do much about it. And that's why I call it the political education of Khalsa Sikhs in the late 1600s. And that's why I also argue against those historians who say that Raj came with Banda Singh Bahadur. Because Banda Singh Bahadur was only in Sikh history for about 4 or 5 years. He would never, in such a short period of time, be able to imprint this idea in the whole community to the extent that it would outlive him, right?
I see what you mean, yeah, fair. Well, I guess the last question I have is, what difference do you hope that people who pick up this book will think about Sikh sovereignty? Hold on, let me rephrase that. What difference do you hope people who pick up this book, The Road to Empire, will make in terms of how we talk or think about Sikh sovereignty, and how will the live podcast hopefully build on that?
One thing I would like Sikhs to take is that basically before people even start speaking about topics like Raj and sovereignty and all these things, first educate yourselves, first study the writings of the world around you, like democracy and all these different isms that have been produced in the last 200 years. Then once you've done that, then start to come up with ideas about sovereignty for Sikhs, if that's what you want to do, right? But it also applies to other areas as well. Sikh education, for instance. First educate yourselves and then come up with ideas. A lot of the issues with the Sikhs around the world is that they're speaking from a point of ignorance. I'm not saying that to attack anyone, but they haven't done comprehensive study of a topic, and then they come up with ideas. They just come up with ideas. Then they start to build a house based on a foundation that's weak. So obviously the house is not going to get that. So basically what I'm trying to show is that before there even was a kingdom, for 25 years before that, or whatever it was, the Sikhs have been studying all this knowledge. So but what I'm basically saying is that rethink. Well, let me say it from a different aspect as well. One thing I would also like is especially for non-Sikhs, like outsiders, academics, professors around the world and so forth, is not just to view the Sikhs back then as a warrior community, because this is how it's been presented to us in the images, the way Sikhs have been presenting themselves and so forth, but also to see the Sikhs as a community of thinkers. And I think hopefully I've done a good job of that in the book by showing and bringing all these names of individuals who were scholars, who were Kavis, court scholars, and there's a big Sikh literati at the time. My next book is actually going into that same topic, but just in the 1700s rather than the 1600s.
I look forward to it, because I think one thing for me, as I mentioned, I did a history degree, and I'm sure everyone who's listened to the podcast is probably sick of me mentioning it, but I did a history degree, and part of that degree in my second year was to do, as I mentioned earlier, a module on the political theory of the Western world or something, and you go through all of those usual white male Western political thinkers, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You obviously learn it ad infinitum, kind of everybody, Rousseau, Aquinas, Thomas Locke, Hume, all of these guys. I enjoyed it because I enjoy that type of philosophical debate and that ability to kind of stretch ideas and go, well, hold on, this doesn't work if this happens, and then you go into Hegel, and then it gets really complicated when you read Hegel and how history is progressing, and then how technically that's actually not a Sikh idea, because if time is cyclical, nothing's ever progressing, it's just repeating ad infinitum. But that's a separate conversation. What I'm trying to get to is that because you are kind of drowned in Western political thought, and there is obviously Eastern political thought, but there is literally nothing, as you've said, in the body of literature that's available that covers Sikh political thought. So I was very excited that this book does that, and as you can see, I have been enjoying reading it. And I think it does do that, and I think it tells quite excellently the story of how ideas, philosophy, culture, the ability to discuss and debate, the ability to kind of engulf other cultures, reproduce them, and kind of understand them on your own terms is central to Sikh history, just full stop. So I just want to say thank you. We've got to the end of the questions for today. Obviously, I'm very excited to host you come November. I hope people listening to this are excited too, or have been at least teased into perhaps wanting to come, and if you do, you can obviously buy your tickets in the description below. But otherwise than that, I just want to say thanks.
And likewise, I look forward to see you soon.
No, awesome. All right, so we've reached the end of this little podcast teaser. I hope you enjoyed it and that it whet your appetite for more. If so, then why wait? Why not get your tickets to our live event in Birmingham on the 3rd of November? As mentioned earlier, we've already sold 60% of our early bird tickets, so secure your seat now. It will be your chance to hear directly from international authors such as Satnam Singh flying in from Denmark and Harleen Singh all the way from Canada. The event isn't going to be recorded or live streamed. Once those seats are taken, that's it. You'll miss your chance to be in the room for this engaging and interesting conversation. Secure your seat today. The link's in the description, and make sure to like, comment and subscribe so others find out too.